So good evening, everybody. It's so good to see you all. We have a big crowd tonight. We have a big crowd waiting and trying to get in. So I hope somehow or other they can figure out how to do that because, it'd be wonderful to hear our lecture tonight. So, and welcome also to our Zoom meeting, but also welcome to this lecture co-sponsored by the Institute for Religion and Science at Chestnut Hill College and the American Teilhard Association. My name is Sister Kathleen Duffy, and I'm the director of the Institute and the president of the American Teilhard Association. And in my spare time, I am. But it's a real pleasure to see so many of you here this evening. I want to introduce Dr. Laura Elo from the University of Dayton and express my gratitude for her technical assistance, which you've all been watching. It's been a big help to me in so many ways, but certainly I don't know what I'd do without Laura. The American Teilhard Association was founded in 1967 to promote knowledge of Teilhard's life and work so that these might make a difference in the way we live in our world. We publish and send to our members the biannual monograph Teilhard Studies, as well as a biannual newsletter, Teilhard Perspective. We also sponsor an annual meeting in May or June and now hope to continue to present events such as these during the year. If you're not a member of the ATA, we welcome you to join us. The Institute for Religion and Science at Chestnut Hill College, a regional center for science and spirituality, was founded in 2011. We sponsor public lectures on topics that relate science technology with religion and spirituality. We also have 2 reading circles, so far anyway, that meet monthly to discuss books and articles about science and religion, including the works of and commentaries on Teilhard. If you are new to these organizations and would like to subscribe to the Institute's mailing list and to become a member of the American Teilhard Association and or join one of these reading circles, which are now being held on Zoom, so you're all welcome, please send an email to me at kduffy@chc.edu. You'll see that on the next slide, so don't worry if you didn't get it right now. kduffy@chc.edu. And I'll send you the next steps. You're more than welcome to join us. It would be great to have you. Now, here is the way that we're going to proceed this evening. First of all, we'll have an introductory session, and after that, we will, first of all, in the introductory session, I will be introducing our speaker, Dr. Donald Wayne Viney, and then we will listen to his lecture. After that, we will end our session with an original song written by Don Viney called Teilhard's Fire, which is based on everybody's favorite Teilhard quotation from Teilhard's essay, The Evolution of Chastity. And so we begin. As science teaches us more and more about the working of our cosmos, and as our society becomes more and more secular, many people continue to ask, how does our knowledge of science, particularly the knowledge of the theory of evolution, impact our understanding of the nature of God and God's action in our world? Others go so far as to ask, do we really need God anymore, given what we know about science? These are challenging questions, and even for those who know what the answers are, it's often difficult for us to articulate the answer that we feel at the center of our being. So that's why it's a real pleasure for me to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Donald Wayne Viney, who will help us to explore these questions. Dr. Viney received degrees in philosophy from Colorado State University and the University of Oklahoma, and is a 3-time recipient of the title University Professor at Pittsburgh State University, Kansas, where he teaches philosophy and religion. Viney publishes primarily in philosophy of religion with a focus on process-relational philosophy and theology. He is the author of Charles Hartshorne and the Existence of God, senior editor of Hartshorne's book, Creative Experiencing, A Philosophy of Freedom. He has recently published with George Shields, The Mind of Charles Hartshorne, A Critical Examination. He's also the author of dozens of scholarly articles and reviews. A fine teacher as well as a scholar, Don has been a recipient of the university's Outstanding Faculty Award and serves on the editorial boards of Process Studies, the Midwest Quarterly, and the American Journal of Theology and Philosophy. I met Don in 2005 at a conference in Claremont, California, organized by the distinguished process philosopher and theologian John Cobb. The purpose of the meeting was to explore connections between Whitehead and Teilhard, process theory and Teilhard. Of course, Don was the ideal panelist since he was already convinced, more than most of us, about the overlap that exists. After hearing Don's talk, I quickly invited him to speak at Chestnut Hill College at our 2005 conference, Rediscovering Fire, a conference that commemorated the 50th anniversary of the publication of The Phenomenon of Man. Don's paper, I'll say it in English, Philosopher in Spite of the Church, which I included in a volume of papers from the conference, is by far one of the best in that volume. Not only is Don a serious process philosopher and fine teacher, he is also a singer and songwriter. We will end our time together this evening by listening to one of Don's original songs, called Teilhard's Fire, which I already told you is based on everybody's favorite Teilhard quotation, so you'll recognize it right away. Please join me in welcoming Don, or Dr. Donald Wayne Viney, to our Zoom meeting.
So, the title of the talk is Evolution's God, Teilhard de Chardin, and the Varieties of Process Theology. I put the picture there of George O'Keeffe's Lawrence tree because it reminds me a little bit of the evolutionary process, but also reaching up towards the stars. But the stars are slightly not visible, so it's sort of an incomplete view of the heavens. And that's kind of the theme, some of the themes of my talk, actually. So, let's see, there we go. So the talk is based on this question that Teilhard asked towards the end of his life. Who at last will give evolution its God? And my primary people in this, the dramatis persona, are Whitehead, Teilhard, and Charles Hartshorne. The whole thing began back when I was an undergraduate student, and I took Teilhard. He was the first one I took seriously as a process thinker, process philosopher, and this was before I knew anything about the academic boundaries that we set up between disciplines. Then I asked Don Crosby, I've got a picture of him there, my teacher, and I said, well, I'd like to do a paper on Teilhard de Chardin as a process philosopher. And Don's response just really brought me up short. He said, well, Teilhard isn't really a process thinker, is he? And I later discovered that Schubert Ogden would say much the same thing in 1984. Teilhard's a philosopher of process only in some broad or improper sense of that word. Well, Don Crosby got me to reading Whitehead, and eventually I met Charles Hartshorne. So I sort of went on a 30-year path of studying a process thought through Whitehead and Hartshorne, and only in 2005, at the conference Kathy mentioned, did I go back to seriously thinking about Teilhard. So these are the people, in my world of process thought, people from John Cobb, David Griffin, some more recent folks there, Dan Dombrowski, Theo Walker. George Shields there, down the left, he passed away in August, I'm sorry to say. He's the co-author of the book that Kathy mentioned that the two of us wrote on Charles Hartshorne. And then Julia Ensing there in Germany is the youngest one of the group. But when I went to Claremont, my world expanded, the people that I knew, and these are some of the people that I met. One I did not meet. I did not meet Ilya Delio. But Kathy was there, John Haught was there, John Grimm and Mary Evelyn Tucker. And then down there at the bottom, the woman in the red blouse is Ursula King. The other woman is my wife. That was the best picture I had of Ursula King. She's in Bristol, England. And so these are the people that became important to me as I studied Teilhard. A wonderful thing. Well, Teilhard was not well received in all quarters, as you all know. His work was dismissed as fiction. I found an interesting sort of two-sided coin here. Peter Medawar wrote a very rather mean-spirited and uncharitable review of the Phenomenon of Man, the first translation of it, in the journal Mind, a philosophy journal, probably maybe the most well-known philosophy journal around. And among other things, he called Teilhard's work philosophy fiction. And then Etienne Gilson, the great medievalist, also was not a very big fan of Teilhard's work, although he had great things to say. He had very flattering things to say about Teilhard's man, that he had met him. But he called Teilhard's work theology fiction. So is it philosophy fiction, theology fiction? What exactly is it? Well, so this leads to the question, what kind of work is Teilhard's work? Well, there are several genres. I can pick at least three, probably more than three, but at least three genres of writing. One is a straightforwardly scientific work. The L'Œuvre Scientifique was published from 1905 to 1955, as you can see there. And it's, 10 volumes, and then there's the last volume there is actually maps. So it's a huge, huge work, and it's done chronologically. But there's also the genre of journals and letters. So there's a bunch of copies of books with his letters. Many of these letters have not been translated yet, which is unfortunate, but it'd be fun to see those translated. So you see there pictures of Pierre Leroy, one of his friends. There's a book with letters from him, and then Ida Treat, and Simon and Max Beguin. And then other people like his cousin, Marguerite Théa-Chambon, and Leontine Zanta. And then, of course, in the middle there, or more recently, a book published of the letters of Lucille Swan and Teilhard de Chardin. The other genre is what I would call his clandestin, where it was actually that was his word for them. These are the works that the church was nervous about and didn't want him to publish. And indeed, he did not publish these works. They get published, of course, after he dies, thanks to Mademoiselle Montier there, you see her picture, who had served as his secretary for some time. And you can see there, that goes to, 13 volumes, plus I've got the Hymn of the Universe there at the end. Beautifully bound, Édition de Seuil, beautifully bound books. So that raises the question of genre of the books that Teilhard was not able to publish. So here's a copy of the Phenomenon of Man. And he says in that it's not to be read as metaphysics or theology. It's at the very beginning. It's to be read as a scientific treatise. But he also says that it might have an appearance of being metaphysical or philosophical because it tries to encompass the entire phenomenon of the entire human phenomenon, and not just what we might call the behavioristic aspects of that phenomenon. He wants to look at the inside of things a lot of times. So he says, like people like Poincaré and Einstein and Jeans, he would say it's kind of, he says it might be called hyperphysics, but not quite, he says, metaphysics, because the way he uses metaphysics, the way he's taught metaphysics from the beginning is it's a science of being. But he wrote to Henri Lubac in 1934, and here's a statement from a letter that he wrote. He says, I mistrust metaphysics in the usual sense of the word because I smell a geometry in it. I think the smell, he didn't like the smell. But I'm ready to recognize another sort of metaphysics which would really be a hyperphysics or a hyperbiology. And he would use that expression, hyperphysics, in other writings that he made. And he says that the usual sense of metaphysics that leads to, he says it leads to geometry and actually theology, because he says it's a kind of pseudo-absolute knowing, but he wants to be grounded in the deliverances of science. So this got me to thinking about the genre of his work, and I think it might best be thought of as speculative philosophy in the way that Whitehead talked about speculative philosophy. Not quite the same, because Whitehead gives us what he calls a categorical scheme that he tries to interpret everything in terms of. So Whitehead talks about the endeavor to frame a coherent, logical, necessary system of general ideas in terms of which every element of our experience can be interpreted. Well, Teilhard's not so far off from that. He doesn't have a speculative scheme in the way that Whitehead did, but he's certainly trying to get a comprehensive view of the human phenomenon and how it fits with the evolutionary process. So in the human phenomenon, he says he wants to develop a homogeneous and coherent perspective of our general experience extended to the human. One of the things I find a little bit strange about Teilhard is that for all of his love of evolution and all of his passion for evolution, he really doesn't mention Charles Darwin all that much. He mentions him only in passing, or Darwinism he mentions in passing. The one who really seems to have affected his views, of course, was Henri Bergson. And he would talk about that for the rest of his life. Now, he didn't write extended essays on either of these people, but Bergson seems to have had more of an effect on him. I interpret what he says about evolution not in terms of Darwinian processes. He knows about these processes. He believes in these processes. But I think he's thinking of evolution as, in the broad sense, as development. He says in the human phenomenon, today, positive knowledge of things is identified with the study of development. There's that famous passage in the human phenomenon where he says, I'm going to read it here. He says, truly blind are those who do not see the amplitude of the movement whose orbit, infinitely surpassing the natural sciences, has successively won and invaded the surrounding domains of chemistry, physics, sociology, and even mathematics and the history of religions. One after another, all the fields of human knowledge have been shaken and carried away by the same current, but the same basic current leads to the study of some development. Evolution, a theory, a system, a hypothesis? Not at all, but much more than that, a general condition to which all theories, all hypotheses, all systems must henceforth bow and satisfy if they are to be thinkable and true. A light illuminating all facts, a curve all lines must follow. He says practically the same thing in almost identical words in other places. In books like Science and Christ and The Vision of the Past, The Appearance of Man, you can find the same exact statement. And for those of you, I'll share my paper with you. And so for those of you who want references, you can certainly have them. So it's really development he's talking about, I think. It's not so much Darwinian processes that interest him. It's the concept of development. So when you see the geologic column, you say, okay, that's a picture of development. All the way from bacteria at the bottom to widespread grasslands at the top, or microorganisms up to the point of modern humans. And so, yes, these are Darwinian processes that do this, that account for this, but more importantly, development. Now, let's see. he says that it infects all of the disciplines. I used to think that the 19th century philosophically was a little bit boring. I didn't much, when it came to teaching 19th century philosophy, I didn't like it. Well, there's Kierkegaard there. He's pretty interesting, and Nietzsche, but otherwise I was kind of bored by it until I started looking at the history of science. And I realized that what was going on in the history of science was the discovery of development. I think of the 19th century as the century of the discovery of development. Because you think about sociology, you think about paleontology, geology, biology, comparative linguistics, psychology at the end of the century. It's really beginning to talk about the concept of development. Some of it in a Darwinian vein, but not all of it. But I think this is what fascinates Teilhard. And of course, this contrasts with the concept that things don't really develop over time. So we've got this concept of the great chain of being, where things are rather static, where God is at the top, angels, human beings, animals, plant life, inanimate matter. We're somewhere stuck between the material and the immaterial world. But there's no transformation of animals into human beings, for example, or plants into animals. It's not the way the medievals had thought, or even the ancients usually. So this leads to a contrast between what I think of the chain of being, the flow of becoming. So the chain of being that I just showed is kind of static spatial categories, fixed categories, in opposition to dynamic and open-ended temporal processes. The great chain of being is indeed a scale of value. God at the top, inanimate matter at the bottom. In the geologic column I showed, there's no explicit value judgments that are made, so you don't say that later is better. And finally, in the great chain of being, you have wed specifically religious ideas with scientific and philosophical concepts. But in the modern world, we've sort of Humpty Dumpty's fallen off the wall, and so we're trying to put it back together again somehow. The religious ideas aren't strictly relevant to that column. So this is where Teilhard, I think, becomes highly relevant. So when he did talk about metaphysics, when he talked about hyperphysics, he spoke of a metaphysic of union. You find this in his early work, and you find it again in his later work. And I've given you very brief quotes here to give you a sense of it. He says in 1917, one of the war essays, each new union, he says, realized increases the absolute quantity of being in the universe. Whitehead has this wonderful statement, the many become one and are increased by one. That's not a process in reality. And then finally, Hartshorne says much the same thing. Creative, he says, means additions to the definiteness of reality. I don't find any difference whatsoever amongst those statements in terms of what they actually intend. Teilhard also, I mentioned before, he wanted to look at the inside of things. And so there's this statement here, coextensive with their without, there is a within of things, a structured, psychically convergent curvature of the world in things. So that the more complex the system, the more capacity for experience and feeling that it has. I found this quote out of Whitehead's Adventures of Ideas where he said, Leibniz explained what it must be like to be an atom. And of course, that's an overstatement. But the idea, if you look at Leibniz, he has the same idea that throughout the natural world, you find varying levels of feeling and consciousness, in contrast to the old Cartesian idea that experience is confined to the human. With an evolutionary picture, Leibniz now makes more sense, and Teilhard knew that, although he didn't talk about Leibniz, that we have varying levels of degrees of mentality or consciousness, from the dimmest stupor, is the way that Leibniz put it, the dimmest stupor of feeling up to sort of the daylight of self-consciousness. You find this in Charles Hartshorne as well. His first book was, there you see it, The Philosophy and Psychology of Sensation, straddles the fields of philosophy and psychology. And then the book that he published in 1973 on an interpretation of world survey of birdsong. He's a practicing scientist. And the book on birdsong has been very well received by ornithologists. The sense of the book is that birds actually have a primitive aesthetic sense. Well, in Hartshorne's work, he defends this idea of what he calls an aesthetic continuum that is throughout the evolutionary ladder. But like I say, from inarticulate feelings to the simplest creatures, the full self-awareness of human beings. He says, in an early work, he says that physical complexity is a sign of psychical complexity. And I thought, well, that sounds just like Teilhard. So here's a little rundown of process relational philosophy as you find it in Whitehead and Hartshorne both. That's Whitehead there. Nature is composed of these dynamic processes. Nature is a theater of interactions among these processes, hence process relational philosophy. There's the dual nature of the stuff of the universe. The elements of the universe are not only objects, they're subjects. They not only have behavioral qualities, they have an inner quality, the within of things that Teilhard talks about. Enduring objects themselves are processes, and reality is open-ended, incomplete. It's in the making. And that last statement is very much the metaphysic of union. So, question is, given this picture of the world that we've got from a developmental evolutionary perspective, what would God look like in such a world? So I've given you, let's see, we need a theism of cosmic dimensions that's friendly to science, but somehow adequate to the dynamic processes of the universe, but also religiously available. So those of us who believe in God, if you can't have a God of love or compassion, what's the point? Then you're back to what Pascal called the God of the philosophers, who doesn't seem to have any real relevance to our religious life. Hartshorne himself said this, from the beginning of his career to the end of his career. He talked about his ultimate intuitive clue in philosophy. This is from the end of his career. He said, "My ultimate intuitive clue in philosophy is that God is love. The idea of God is definable as that of the being worthy to be loved with all one's heart, mind, soul, and entire being." Now, of course, that sounds like the New Testament, but Hartshorne would not have considered himself a Christian, but he was certainly raised by Christian parents, but he never actually tried to defend Christianity. So, the process relational theology, here's a little primer of that. I'm taking language here mostly from Hartshorne, but a little bit from Whitehead as well. So God surpasses us as a creator. God surpasses all as a creator, but unique in scope and excellence. All real beings are creative in some degree, and so there's no such thing as a creation ex nihilo. Now that's also Teilhard's view. He says, this was a statement by Hartshorne later in life. He said, God is the most and best moved mover. He took inspiration from Rabbi Abraham Heschel, who said that God is the most moved mover. And Hartshorne said, just add two little words to that and you've got the perfect formula. God is the most and best moved mover. God is affected by and affects other creatures. And this is what Hartshorne would call the divine relativity. He writes a book called The Divine Relativity. God has a future. There's no such thing as merely timeless knowledge, except perhaps for mathematics. God experiences tragedy, as we shall see, and God is the inexhaustible ground of hope. I don't find this principle of ontological correlativity explicitly stated in any of the three writers I'm talking about. But I would define the principle this way. Concepts of God and the world are correlative. They have implications for each other. The closest I found of this principle is from Hartshorne, where he says that an analogical thought about God that starts from a false idea of the ordinary case is bound to result in a false idea of God and vice versa. So he states it a little differently. You might call that a corollary of the ontological correlativity principle. And I believe that this principle is implicit in what Teilhard talks about. I think it's implicit in Hartshorne and also in Whitehead. Now, to show you a little bit how this principle might work, here's a picture of the classical model of God's relation to the world. You go back to, Augustine, Boethius, Philo of Alexandria, all the way back to the beginnings of classical theism. God is related to all of time, analogous to the way the center of a circle is related to the points on its circumference. So just as all of the radii of the circle are equal, so God is equidistant, God is equally active at each point in the temporal process. So in this case, I've updated their diagram by putting a big bang in there, because today we talk about a big bang. So that would represent the beginning of the universe, of our universe, but then God would be equally present at each moment. Those arrows also represent creativity. So God creates the Big Bang, but also God is where you are and creating actually right now and in our future. So there's no past or future for God, only for us. Now, what that implies is that it's possible for the world to be a complete fact, just as God creates it as a complete fact. All developmental processes take place on that circumference. They don't take place in the radii. That's not a developmental process. That's an immediate creation ex nihilo. One way to get a handle on that, I think, is to look at J.M.E. McTaggart's concept of an A series versus a B series. I'm going to modify this just a little bit. But here's an A series of events. It's two ways of marking time. You mark time by thinking of time as passing. You say, okay, there's a present moment. As you can see in my this is my static diagram of a moving now. The arrow represents movement. So there's a moving present that goes from event to event. And in the series shown here, event 2 is in the present, whereas event 1 is in the past, event 3 is in the future. All right? But there's another way of marking time, and he calls that a V series. And this is a series where you simply talk about before and after. So each event is actually a now. There's no moving now. Every event is a now. There's no such thing as a privileged present. But you have this array of events. It's a static array, kind of like a calendar that's already filled in, or think of a novel maybe that's already been written. So you know it from beginning to end. That's a B series. And that's also classical theism. So here's a statement from Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy. Boethius, the 6th century philosopher. God embraces the whole of everlasting life in one simultaneous present. Simultaneous there's got to be a metaphor, because he doesn't believe that simultaneous is a temporal predicate. But he's using it to talk about God's relation to all of time. So in effect, it looks like God embraces a B series totality of everlasting time, so that the only present is one that is in fact eternal, or paradoxically a timeless now. It's paradoxical because nows that we're familiar with have a past and a future, but not God's. You may recall the joke that St. Augustine makes at the end of the Confessions. He asks the question, what was God doing before the creation of the world? He says, well, some people say that God was making hell for those who would later ask the question. and then he said, but then he turns around and says, but that's a joke, of course. That's just a pleasantry. And then he gives a serious answer to the question, and that is that the question itself simply does not make sense. A little bit like asking what's north of the North Pole. There's nothing north of the North Pole, everything south of that on the spinning sphere. So here's the modification of the A series that I was talking about. The A series, as I showed it before, you had a line and then you had a moving present going along the line. In this case, the present moment is actually crucial because it transforms the indeterminacy or the relative vagueness of the future, of possible futures, into an actual past. So the way I've tried to draw this to illustrate this is have the dotted lines as the possible futures, however many that might be. I've just got 2 there, but maybe there's dozens, So we have past events. You don't change the past, but you do have an effect on what the future shall be. Moreover, what this seems to imply, or I think what it does imply, is that this is the way that we think about the temporal process of development. Then you have to say that the B series is something that actually comes into being seriatim. It happens, it's not always there. So the example I use in my paper is that there was a time when it was not true that Aristotle was born after Socrates. And that's because when Socrates dies, Aristotle has yet to be born. So what you have is a relatively indeterminate future where you have certain possibilities. Like there's the possibility of a famous philosopher whose name will be Aristotle, who was born in Stagira and did logic, for example. Those are vague possibilities, but they're not actual until Aristotle himself comes to exist. Another consequence of the classical view is this famous statement from Aquinas' Summa, where he talks about the difference between real and rational relations. He says the creatures are really related to God himself, whereas in God there is no real relation to creatures, but a relation only in idea, inasmuch as the creatures are related to him. What that means is God is the only one who actually has an effect on things. We have no effect on God. And that fit with the old idea of impassibility, that God can't be affected by anything external to us, or external to God, The circle diagram I gave you before, you noticed I put the radii were arrows going out. You have no arrows going in. And that also fit with the idea of God's perfect simplicity, that just as a point has no dimensions, so God has no dimensions, no parts. But I think this frustrated Teilhard. So you read his letters to Pierre Leroy, and you see just how frustrated he gets. I'm completely done with the theologians, he says. Still, I become furious when I see them maintain Christianity in so stunted a form that the Gentiles, to say nothing of so many Christians, are disgusted by it. But he really sees a need to reform the concept of God. And this shows just how radical he gets where traditional categories are concerned. He actually opts for what Hartshorne later called the divine relativity. So he says, let us forget about this being existing by itself and being existing by another, and let's affirm a strictly bilateral and complementary relationship between God and the world. Properly speaking, he says, God does not make. He makes things make themselves. Turns out that he's not the first guy to say that. My French friend here, Jules Lepier, said it back in the middle of the 19th century. He said, Lepier was explicitly addressing Thomas Aquinas when he said, relation of God to the creature is just as real as the relation of the creature to God. And he said in a letter to Charles Renouvier, God who created me, creator of myself. So this anticipates Teilhard by several years. Other people said this too. What's the fellow who wrote the Water Babies? I can't remember his name. Charles Kingsley. He said much the same thing. And then Hartshorne says much the same thing in his book on the divine relativity. He says God must be qualified by creaturely choices. When Hartshorne came to the University of Oklahoma in 1981 to give a talk, to prepare for his talk, one of the reporters of the school newspaper came to me and asked about him. And so I was telling the reporter about, Hartshorne's importance. And I mentioned the divine relativity, the book. And the reporter printed the divine reality instead of the divine relativity. I showed it to Hartshorne, and he read the article over, and he says, well, this is nice. He says, there's only one problem. He says, my book is the divine relativity. And then he said, how many people do you know who have written a book on the divine relativity? He says, lots have written about the divine reality. How many have written about the divine relativity? Well, it turns out, actually not very many. Or those who did weren't very friendly to it, except for people like Lepier and Teilhard. Going back to classical theism, this is Hartshorne's way of thinking about this. He says that the classical tradition put God on one side and the world of the creatures on the other side of these ultimate metaphysical contrasts. So you have creator, created, one, many, active, passive, and so forth. So God is all those things on the left, and the creatures are all those things on the right. What Hartshorne is going to do, and what I think Teilhard does, and definitely Whitehead, is to mess this thing up quite a bit and to say, well, Now look, there's really, in some sense, God is both creator and created. If there's a two-way, what did Teilhard say, strictly bilateral relationship between God and the world, then God is perhaps the eminent creator, but not the only creator. We also create. God is one, but in some sense God is many. Or what's the one down here? Simple and complex. Teilhard actually says that we need to talk about the complexity of God in contrast to the medieval concept of the simplicity of God. Now the question is, how are you going to do this? How are you going to combine these two things in God and say, okay, God is both creator and created? Doesn't that, Thomas Aquinas and others would say, doesn't that reduce God to a creature? The elegance of the traditional view is that you have this really beautiful distinction between God and the creatures, and the only thing that really complicates it is the incarnation. You could deal with that separately, but this, how do you put these things together? Here's how Hartshorne does it. David Tracy, the theologian in Chicago, David Tracy, calls this Hartshorne's discovery. I heard this in St. Louis years ago. But he says, Hartshorne says that in God you can make a distinction, in God and in the creatures, you can make a distinction between existence, essence, and actuality. So here I've got a woman listening to a bird. She's listening to a word, let's say she's listening to a wood thrush. Okay, so if I know the information that she's listening to this wood thrush, I can deduce from that she has a certain cognitive capacity to hear the wood thrush. I can deduce from that she exists. But if I only have the information that she exists, I cannot deduce the information that she has a certain cognitive capacity, and I cannot deduce the information that she's listening to this particular bird at this particular time. So in other words, her actuality of actually listening to the bird is information rich compared to her essence and compared to her existence. Now, Hartshorne says that you can make exactly the same distinction where God is concerned. So that God has a certain actuality, an actual state. For example, in this case, God would be knowing the woman was listening to the wood thrush. God's cognitive capacity would be the essence of being all-knowing. That is, if she is listening to the bird, then God must know it. And finally, that God exists. Now, in the case of God, the difference between God and the creature in this case, the way that Hartshorne preserves the difference, is to say that God's essence and God's existence are necessary, whereas in the case of the woman, her essence and existence are not. That is to say, we live a very fugitive existence. We come to be and then we die. So we're unlike God in that respect. Our existence is contingent, possible to not be. But it's not possible for God not to be in this picture. But what remains of the distinction is that just like the woman listening to the bird, so God knowing the woman listening to the bird is concrete in relation to the abstract qualities of, say, existing or having certain cognitive capacities. This allows Hartshorne and Whitehead to say that there can be this two-way relationship between God and the world. You can say, with this kind of thinking, you can say, not only is the woman listening to the bird, God knows she's listening to the bird. Why? Because she's listening to the bird. Thomas Aquinas had turned that cognitive relation upside down and said, in the case of God, God's not very knowledge, it's causative. In the case of Hartshorne, he says, no, that doesn't make any sense. It's the world actually causes things to happen in God. It doesn't cause God to be omniscient. That would be an abstract essence, but it does cause certain things to happen in God's cognitive life. Okay, so far, what I've given you is a way of shoring up some of Teilhard's ideas. I've showed you how his ideas are very similar to what you find in Hartshorne and Whitehead. And I could name a whole bunch of others that I actually don't cover in the paper, but which are equally striking ideas of overlap. But now I want to move to something where there's not overlap. And this is in this slide, where you have another sort of signature statement from Teilhard, where he says, everything that rises inevitably converges. The little medallion there doesn't have the whole quote. He says, ce qui monte, tout ce qui monte inévitablement converge. He says inevitably it converges. Now, he doesn't say that things inevitably rise. He says that if they rise, they inevitably converge. So that gives you a little bit of chance and free play in the system. But it's converging where? To the unity, absolute unity with God, which, as all of you know, that we could call the omega point. Well, what's lost? Flannery O'Connor wrote this short story called Everything That Rises Must Converge. She was a fan of Teilhard de Chardin. But she points out, that this grand vision of everything rising that must converge, there's the dross, there's what's left behind, there's the injustice, the suffering, the sin, human orneriness. It's a fantastic story. So, are there divergent paths? Whitehead said to his student, A.H. Johnson, there is tragedy, even God does not escape. And Hartshorne says the same thing. He's very insistent. There's chance and there's tragedy, even for God. This is part of what creaturely freedom means. Teilhard, I've never found him anything in Teilhard that talks about tragedy in God. He does, he was in the trenches in World War I, so he knew tragedy firsthand, even more so than Hartshorne would have known. Maybe not Whitehead. Whitehead lost a son during the war. But Teilhard saw firsthand the terribleness of war.
But he found it.
And yet he seems he seems entranced by the vision of evolution, which somehow brings all of this into a consummation of the omega point. And you sometimes wonder if he's lost sight of the tragedy and the suffering, the evil in the world. That's something that certainly Hartshorne and Whitehead emphasize in their own writings. So there is this a slight divergence. I don't know that the concept of the convergence of the evolutionary process is incompatible with what Whitehead or Hartshorne says, but it's certainly not something they emphasize. Whitehead himself seems to think that there is no far-off divine event towards which all creation moves, right, in the way that Teilhard does. And Hartshorne doesn't seem to think that either. The most that they talk about the distant future would be cosmic epochs. So you might have a series of, a big bang and a big crunch, a big bang and a crunch, for example. But nothing like what Teilhard is talking about. But there is, nevertheless, in talking about the future, the more immediate future, there would be the problem of human orneriness and overcoming that, and overcoming our narrow identities. So Teilhard writes to his cousin and says, I would like to express the psychology of one who sees himself no more as French or as Chinese, but as terrestrian or terrestrial. And Hartshorne takes it maybe one step further. He says the power of living consciously as a citizen of the cosmos is the basic human prerogative. And more fully it's realized, the more clearly it reveals itself as the vision of God. Mm-hmm. Here's a famous statement by Teilhard. It was published pretty early after he died. Wow. The age of nations past, the question before us now, if we would not perish, was to shake off old prejudices and to build the earth. I love that. Wow. And then another statement from Teilhard. There's a communion. This is from an early piece, the Cosmic Life. There's a communion with God, a communion with the earth, a communion with God through the earth. Beautiful statement. And then we'll be listening to the Teilhard's Fire later. Well, there's so much more to say. Like I said, I will be happy to share my paper with everybody, whoever wants to look at it. It's been pared down from a rather lengthy thing down to about 26 pages, so it's readable. And that's pretty much what I've got to say. Now, how do I stop sharing? Okay. Is that okay?
That's great. Yeah, thank you.
All right.
And now, and I want to thank you for this engaging lecture. I'm sure we have more than enough to talk about as we gather in our breakout rooms for a short discussion.
Exit. Come the day gathering, the winds, the tides, and space. Gravity itself within our power. We will tap a release for God, love's energies entire. Such our hope and our most beauteous hour. And then for a second time, in the history of the world, we have once again discovered fire. The sun is scattered in the rain, just so is love divine. No two droplets quite the same, yet in union shine. Quelques jours après l'espace, les vents et les marées, et même la gravitation, nous capterons pour Dieu les énergies de l'amour. C'est l'étoile de nos espérances. Et alors une deuxième fois, dans l'histoire du monde, nous aurons encore trouvé le feu. L'amour devint notre agonie, en nous et pas lequel l'union différencie une règle universelle. And then for a second time in the history of the world, we'll have once again discovered fire.